Deep within the shadowed woodlands of northern New York, a discovery made in 1862 would haunt investigators for generations. Beneath the rotting floor of a long-abandoned stone church, workers uncovered 143 unmarked burial sites. None bore names. None bore prayers. Every set of remains told a story of prolonged suffering. Bones showed fractures that had healed and then been broken again. Rib cages carried the unmistakable marks of repeated suffocation. Several skulls bore carved symbols, etched not after death, but while the victims were still alive. For more than a century and a half, official government files connected to this site known as the Church of the Pure Spirits remained locked away, accessible only to a narrow circle of federal authorities. Recently uncovered documents, never released to the public, describe how a single family engineered one of the most horrifying religious movements in American history. These records detail how three brothers remembered as Elder Ezra, Deacon Silas, and Prophet Caleb Ravencroft persuaded hundreds that agony was sacred and that salvation could only be reached through deliberate torment. In the early 1800s, the rural settlement of Ravenwood, New York, appeared unremarkable by frontier standards. Situated roughly 40 miles north of Albany, the town housed no more than 300 residents. Its people lived simple lives sustained by farming, lumber work, and modest trade with neighboring villages. Founded in 1803 by families migrating north from the Hudson Valley, Ravenwood was built on hope, isolation, and the promise of new beginnings. Yet, Ravenwood sat at the heart of what historians would later call the Second Great Awakening, a volatile era of spiritual upheaval that swept across the young nation. This region earned the grim nickname the Burned-Over District, as revival movements ignited and consumed communities with relentless intensity. Old churches fractured, new doctrines rose overnight. Charismatic preachers gathered crowds numbering in the thousands, preaching redemption through emotion rather than tradition. Into this unsettled religious climate arrived the Ravencroft brothers in the summer of 1825. Ezra, the eldest at 42, carried himself with unquestioned authority. His heavy gaze seemed to lock onto listeners with unsettling precision, as though he were weighing their souls. Silas, 3 years younger, appeared scholarly and restrained his fingers, stained with ink, his sermons carefully structured and deceptively calm. Caleb, the youngest, unsettled nearly everyone who encountered him. His quiet voice traveled unnaturally far, and during sermons his pale eyes often rolled back as he claimed to witness visions beyond human understanding. The brothers arrived with considerable wealth. They purchased land on the edge of town and immediately began constructing a church unlike any others in the region. Rather than white clapboard walls, the Church of the Pure Spirit rose from dark stone cut from nearby hills. Its design was striking. An octagonal central hall surrounded by 8 enclosed chambers, crowned by an unusually tall steeple. Most unsettling of all, the sanctuary contained no windows. Services were held under lantern light alone. At their first gathering, Elder Ezra addressed a crowd drawn by curiosity more than belief. He spoke of a divine calling, of a world corrupted by false faiths, and of purification achieved only through hardship. The brothers' arrival could not have been better timed. Traditional denominations were losing influence. New movements, Methodists, Baptists, and experimental sects were gaining ground. Within a few years, even the foundations of Mormonism would emerge less than 100 miles away. The Ravencrofts' teachings began gently. They preached that sin clung to the human body, and only suffering could burn it away. At first, this suffering was symbolic fasting, prayer, cold water rituals meant to cleanse the soul. But unlike other churches, the Ravencrofts insisted the pain must be real. Silas often explained that the body itself was corrupted, and only by breaking it could the spirit rise free. Membership grew steadily. Prospective followers were required to undergo private evaluations with Prophet Caleb, who claimed to discern whether they were worthy vessels. Those accepted fell largely into 3 groups: the impoverished seeking belonging, the grief-stricken seeking meaning, and the wealthy seeking experiences beyond ordinary worship. One of the earliest converts was Margaret Wilkins, a widow devastated by disease that had claimed her family. In later writings recovered by investigators, she described how Elder Ezra convinced her that her grief was not meaningless but preparation. By 1827, the congregation numbered nearly 100. Many donated their property and savings, persuaded that earthly attachments obstructed spiritual ascent. The most devoted were elevated to a special status known as vessels of the Spirit, required to endure increasingly severe purification rites. While outsiders saw harmless rituals, the brothers were quietly intensifying the process, conditioning their followers to accept escalating brutality without resistance. By 1829, construction began beneath the church itself. Underground chambers were carved out of stone, hidden from view. At this point, the Ravencrofts exercised complete authority over the minds and bodies of their followers. As later documents would reveal, Prophet Caleb privately declared the flock fully prepared. The turning point came on December 21, 1829, the winter solstice. That night, known within sealed church records as the First Ascension, marked the irreversible descent into darkness. As temperatures fell below freezing, nearly 150 followers gathered inside the sealed sanctuary. Candles illuminated a massive spiral carved into the floor, winding toward a raised platform at its center. What followed would not emerge publicly for decades, but by dawn, the Church of the Pure Spirit was no longer a religion. It had become something far more terrifying. By the time the ritual finally ended, the three chosen lay motionless against their wooden frames. Their bodies sagged unnaturally, breath shallow, eyes unfocused, but they were still alive. Elder Ezra stepped forward and declared that the final impurities had been drawn out of them. What remained, he proclaimed, were vessels made ready to receive the pure spirit itself. What followed would linger in the memories of those present long after they fled or perished. Prophet Caleb approached each of the three in turn. He placed his hands upon their heads and whispered words no one else could hear. According to later testimony, the reaction was immediate and horrifying. The victims began to convulse with violent force, arching against their restraints so fiercely that the sound of breaking bone echoed through the sanctuary. Their eyes snapped open, blood vessels rupturing as they spoke in the same incomprehensible language Caleb had earlier displayed. By the time dawn crept over Ravenwood, all three were dead. Elder Ezra announced their success with absolute certainty. Their souls, he claimed, had been so perfectly purified that judgment itself had been bypassed. Their bodies, he told the congregation, were no longer corpses, but sacred remnants worthy of reverence. Rather than burial, the bodies were carried into one of the newly completed chambers beneath the church. There they were laid upon stone slabs, where followers were encouraged to kneel, pray, and contemplate their own future elevation. Church documents seized decades later confirm. These were the first entries in what would become a growing subterranean collection. The morning after the First Ascension, several members quietly gathered their belongings and left Ravenwood without explanation. Thomas Hartford was among them. He would remain silent for years, convinced no one would believe such atrocities could occur beneath the banner of Christianity. Those who stayed behind became more devoted than ever. The brothers had crossed into ritualized murder and, instead of weakening their authority, it bound their remaining followers tighter. Death itself had become holy. As one later witness recalled Prophet Caleb telling his brothers, the congregation had now seen the true face of divinity and had not turned away. From that moment forward, resistance was no longer a concern. The First Ascension was not an end, but a beginning. Over the next 15 years, the Church of the Pure Spirit transformed quietly, almost invisibly, into something far more organized and far more dangerous. Between 1830 and 1845, the Ravencroft brothers refined both doctrine and method. Publicly, they emphasized charity, renewal, and moral discipline messages that blended seamlessly with the broader religious revival sweeping the region. They hosted visiting ministers. They donated to temperance leagues and orphan relief funds. To outsiders, they appeared no different from dozens of other revivalist communities scattered across upstate New York. Below ground, however, the operation expanded relentlessly. What had begun as simple storage spaces evolved into a labyrinth of tunnels and chambers stretching far beyond the church's foundations. Outside laborers were quietly dismissed and replaced by trusted members. Eventually, excavation was performed exclusively by those deemed fully surrendered to the will of the Spirit. By the mid-1830s, the underground complex included multiple chambers, each with a designated purpose. There were rooms for isolation, where candidates were kept in silence for days, rooms where trials were administered, rooms where final rites occurred, and most disturbing of all, a space known only among the inner circle as the Chamber of Saints. Unlike traditional faiths that buried their dead, the Ravencrofts preserved them. Some bodies were treated with chemical solutions derived from medical texts. Others were stripped to bone through methods investigators would later struggle to reconstruct. The remains were arranged carefully posed in prayer, ecstasy, or submission, sometimes wired into position to maintain their form. Elizabeth Carver, who joined the church in 1832 and escaped 12 years later, provided some of the clearest descriptions. She spoke first of the smell, not decay, but sharp chemicals mixed with something sickeningly sweet. She was told it was holiness. Only later did she understand it was preservation. New members were introduced gradually, first as symbolism and partial access. Finally, for the most loyal, full exposure. By the time she stood among the preserved remains, Carver recalled feeling awe instead of horror. Indoctrination had done its work. What should have inspired terror felt sacred. As years passed, elevations increased in frequency. Records show a slow escalation from rare ceremonies to seasonal events, then monthly rites timed with solstices and equinoxes. Victims were initially chosen from the socially isolated. Later, entire families offered children willingly, believing the sacrifice divine. Internally, power shifted. Prophet Caleb's visions began dictating nearly all decisions. His writings grew erratic, filled with anatomical sketches and fragmented theology. He became convinced that the soul existed throughout the body in measurable points, in that each death refined his understanding. As membership approached 300, a new problem emerged: evidence. The solution was as cold as it was profitable. Bodies were sold to medical schools struggling to obtain cadavers legally. Deacon Silas leveraged academic contacts, arranging discreet transfers under the guise of donation. Between 1840 and 1845, dozens of victims vanished into laboratories across the Northeast. The arrangement disposed of remains, generated income, and provided Silas with medical knowledge that further refined their cruelty. By the mid-1840s, the church had become a closed system: indoctrination, murder, profit, and devotion feeding one another. It operated openly, shielded by religious freedom, while rumors quietly spread. People joined and were never seen again. Survivors fled in silence. The first serious crack appeared in 1847, when a postal inspector named James Thornhill noticed unusual financial patterns connected to the church: large cash deposits, transfers labeled as research donations. His concerns deepened when he encountered a former member who spoke of underground chambers and vanished children. Medical testimony soon followed. A physician reported examining bodies bearing signs of repeated trauma inflicted before death. Patterns emerged. Still, authorities hesitated until 1851, when Prophet Caleb's deteriorating mind finally collapsed. His public breakdown in Ravenwood's town square shattered the illusion. Covered in wounds, he screamed of chambers, blood, and ascension. He was detained as a madman until his identity became known. When interviewed, he alternated between silence and confession, drawing detailed maps of what lay beneath the church. With this evidence, officials finally moved, but not before Elder Ezra and Deacon Silas enacted their final contingency. Fire consumed parts of the church. Tunnels were collapsed, water diverted. When authorities arrived, they were greeted with cooperation and scripture, yet enough remained: tools, chemicals, bodies. What investigators found beneath the ashes defied language. A scene beyond anything this office has encountered. Federal investigator Daniel Blackwood wrote in his formal report, skeletal remains had been arranged in positions of prayer. Partially preserved bodies sat upright, positioned as if attending some grotesque service. Most disturbing were the smaller alcove-style spaces containing the remains of children posed in scenes of play. Their placement deliberately tender, yet their bones bearing unmistakable signs of violent death. Even veteran investigators were shaken. Newspaper coverage, constrained by Victorian decorum, could not fully describe what had been uncovered. Yet public reaction was swift and horrified. On June 25, 1851, the Albany Evening Journal ran a stark headline: "Sacred ground exposed as chamber of death, religious leaders accused of unspeakable crimes." As authorities worked to identify victims and trace the scope of the crimes, Elder Ezra and Deacon Silas maintained their innocence. They claimed Prophet Caleb had acted alone, conducting secret rites without their consent. Given the rigid compartmentalization within the church, this defense might have introduced doubt had investigators not uncovered one final devastating artifact. Hidden beneath the floor of Deacon Silas's private quarters lay a leather-bound ledger, written in his unmistakable hand. It cataloged every elevation from 1829 to 1851. Names, dates, methods, marginal. Notes detailing the handling and sale of remains. Most damning were explicit references assigning responsibility to all three brothers, including entries noting Elder Ezra's direct role in selecting candidates. Combined with survivor testimony and Prophet Caleb's fractured confession, the ledger erased any remaining uncertainty. On July 3, 1851, Elder Ezra and Deacon Silas Ravencroft were formally arrested on charges, including multiple counts of murder, fraud, and desecration of human remains. What followed became one of the most sensational trials of the mid-19th century. Much of the most graphic evidence was withheld from the public, officials fearing widespread moral panic and religious backlash. Even so, each new revelation deepened the sense that Ravenwood was only the surface of something far larger. As summer progressed, investigators realized they were not dismantling a single cult, but uncovering an extensive criminal system that reached into religious institutions, financial networks, and medical academia. Prophet Caleb, deemed mentally unfit, was committed to the state asylum in Utica. The remaining followers scattered, some fleeing prosecution. Others left hollow and disoriented, struggling to reconcile faith with horror. Blackwood established a temporary headquarters in Ravenwood, assembling records, correspondence, and forensic findings. From this mosaic emerged a chilling conclusion. The Ravencrofts' crimes did not begin in New York. Confidential reports traced similar patterns back decades: Connecticut, Pennsylvania, Ohio. Each location followed the same arc: spiritual community. Vulnerable followers, disappearances, sudden departure. Ravenwood was not unique in nature. Blackwood noted only in scale and duration. Documents recovered from a concealed vault revealed the brothers had operated under multiple aliases, refining their doctrine and methods with each relocation. Even more disturbing was evidence suggesting they had collaborators. Letters between Deacon Silas and representatives of several medical colleges implied awareness, if not outright complicity, in the source of the bodies being supplied. One letter from a Philadelphia anatomist praised the unusual preparation of specimens, remarking that the tissues showed signs of deliberate anatomical conditioning prior to death. This revelation shifted the investigation into darker territory. The Ravencrofts had not merely cloaked murder in religion, they had conducted systematic experimentation on living subjects. Findings were recorded, bodies were sold, knowledge was exchanged. Medical experts reviewing the evidence described patterns consistent with early physiological research. Injuries followed controlled sequences. Preservation methods suggested intent to study tissue response. Pain, it appeared, was not just ritual, it was data. In August of 1851, the case took another unexpected turn. A respected Boston physician came forward with information that reframed everything. Dr. Jonathan Crane recalled a visiting lecturer he had encountered as a student decades earlier, a man presenting radical theories on pain, transcendence, and ecstatic states. His methods had seemed unethical even then. Seeing illustrations of Deacon Silas in the newspapers, Crane recognized him instantly. The lecturer, known then as Simon Ravenwood, and Silas Ravencroft were one and the same. This connection suggested the Church of the Pure Spirit was not merely a religious facade but a carefully constructed framework designed to enable long-term human experimentation, shielded by faith and protected by reverence. What investigators were only beginning to understand was that the Ravencroft brothers had not stumbled into monstrosity. They had been moving toward it deliberately for decades. And though arrests had been made and trials loomed, the full truth of what they uncovered, how many lives were taken, how far the network extended, and how deeply the darkness had embedded itself, remained incomplete. The name Ravencroft was finally exposed to the light, but the shadows it left behind would take generations to fully uncover. Investigators now understood that the religious doctrine of the Church of the Pure Spirit had not merely excused violence, It had been engineered to enable it. Faith was the mechanism. Suffering was the tool. Knowledge was the goal. The belief system the Ravencroft brothers constructed did not simply tolerate cruelty. It sanctified it, transforming experimentation into sacrament. This realization led authorities to a final, concealed chamber beneath Deacon Silas's living quarters. Behind a false stone wall, they uncovered hundreds of notebooks stacked in crude shelves, each filled edge to edge with diagrams, measurements, and observations. Early volumes were laced with religious symbolism, but as years passed, the language shifted, scripture faded, numbers replaced prayer. By the late 1840s, the journals read less like sermons and more like laboratory records. One entry, dated 1848, described a subject's physical response in chilling precision, tracking consciousness, respiration, blood loss, and vocal patterns with detached efficiency. The handwriting was steady, clinical, entirely devoid of spiritual justification. When confronted with this evidence during questioning, Elder Ezra's carefully maintained composure collapsed. According to interrogation transcripts, he laughed a long, unrestrained sound that startled those present. When he finally spoke, his words stripped away the last illusion of devotion. He told investigators that the force they worshipped had many names. To some, it was God. To others, science. He insisted their work pursued understanding. Others lacked the courage to seek. The suffering, he claimed, had value. The death's purpose. The revelation sent tremors through the medical establishment. Institutions that had accepted specimens or data linked to the Ravencrofts found themselves under intense scrutiny. Questions arose that extended far beyond Ravenwood about ethical boundaries, oversight, and how easily ambition could eclipse morality when shielded by authority. As autumn settled over upstate New York, excavation of the church grounds continued. Initial estimates based on Prophet Caleb's ravings had suggested just over 200 victims. The truth proved far worse. By September, Blackwood reported confirmed remains exceeding 270 individuals, with evidence suggesting further burial sites beneath neighboring land. Tunnel patterns showed deliberate outward expansion, mirroring the growth of the operation itself. The investigation darkened further with the discovery of correspondence indicating not all victims had entered Ravenwood willingly. Letters revealed a system for identifying outsiders, travelers, laborers, immigrants, those unlikely to be immediately missed. Promises of work or shelter were used to lure them in. Once arrived, they vanished into the underground network. This evidence fundamentally altered the case. What had begun as religious fanaticism now resembled organized abduction, murder, and human experimentation conducted for both profit and research. And the scope suggested the brothers had not acted in isolation. Each new document widened the circle of implication. Each excavation uncovered another layer of brutality. What investigators had once believed was an isolated horror now appeared to be part of a much larger, deeply embedded system. And still, questions remained unanswered. How many more victims lay undiscovered? How far did the network extend? How many institutions had benefited knowingly or otherwise from the suffering beneath Ravenwood? The deeper authorities looked, the clearer it became. The fall of the Ravencroft brothers did not mark the end of this story. It marked the beginning of a reckoning that would echo far beyond a single town, a single church, or a single name. The darkness uncovered beneath the Church of the Pure Spirit was not confined to the past. It was a warning. What happened next would finally expose the true scale of the Ravencroft operation. The decisive break came in October of 1851, when investigators tracked down Samuel Parsons, a former accountant for the Church of the Pure Spirit. Once trusted with managing finances from 1835 through 1849, Parsons had vanished years earlier, and was eventually located living under an assumed identity in western Massachusetts. Granted immunity, Parsons explained that he had fled after uncovering the reality behind the church's accounts. What he believed were donations and lawful investments, he said, gradually revealed a darker pattern. Certain expenses coded references to preparation costs, research allocations, and transport fees aligned too closely with unexplained disappearances among the congregation. Fearing discovery, he began maintaining a private ledger. When Elder Ezra learned of it, Parsons was informed he had been selected for what the church called special prayer counseling. By then, he understood the phrase meant something else entirely. He escaped that very night, leaving everything behind. Though he no longer possessed his records, Parsons provided investigators with names, dates, and transactions recalled in striking detail. He identified medical institutions that had paid for bodies and data, affluent benefactors who believed they were supporting legitimate inquiry, and church members who had knowingly facilitated logistics, transport, and recruitment. Most damning of all was his disclosure of a second Satan-isolated farmhouse nearly 40 miles from Ravenwood, purchased discreetly through an intermediary in 1840. The property had been reserved for what Ezra described as special work. Parsons remembered it being called the Garden. Only the brothers and 2 trusted aides ever visited. Supplies arrived monthly under cover of darkness. Instruments, chemicals, restraints, and occasionally, selected individuals. None were ever seen again. When authorities located the farmhouse, they found something far worse than expected. The structure had been transformed into a fully equipped research compound, divided into specialized rooms, tailored for different forms of experimentation. Records showed the site had been used for prolonged studies, with subjects kept alive for weeks or even months while procedures were performed, observed, and meticulously recorded. The most devastating revelation came from a detached outbuilding on the property. Inside were smaller enclosures and equipment designed for children. Documentation confirmed that at least 37 minors, some no older than 4, had been confined there between 1840 and 1851. The entries tracked growth, endurance, and response with a level of cold precision that stunned even seasoned investigators. Public reaction was immediate and explosive. Newspapers that had once reported cautiously now abandoned restraint altogether. Headlines spoke of inhuman monsters and crimes against the defenseless. Crowds gathered outside courthouses and government offices, demanding swift punishment and public accountability. Political leaders, sensing the fury, pushed for a prosecution that would serve as a warning to the nation. Inside the prison, the brothers began to unravel. Guards reported that Elder Ezra spoke to unseen figures for hours at a time, arguing, pleading, sometimes laughing. Deacon Silas fared worse. After being confronted with evidence recovered from the garden, he attempted to take his own life and was placed under constant supervision. As the year 1851 drew toward its end, the case against the Ravencrofts had grown overwhelming. What began as whispers of heresy and abuse had evolved into proof of systematic exploitation. Calculated murder and a philosophy that reduced human life to raw material. Yet even then, as prosecutors assembled their final arguments, one question lingered in the minds of all involved: whether the truth, now laid bare, would be enough to fully account for the darkness the brothers had unleashed, or whether some part of it would always remain buried, just beyond reach. By the close of 1851, what had begun as a regional nightmare had transformed into a spectacle gripping the entire nation. The impending trial was already being described as one of the most consequential criminal proceedings in American history, not only because of the charges themselves, but because of what they threatened to expose. Questions of religious liberty, medical responsibility, and the terrifying ease with which atrocity could hide behind respectability all converged in a single courtroom. Yet even as preparations advanced, investigator Blackwood remained unsettled. The scope of the brothers' activities troubled him deeply. Their crimes had unfolded across decades in multiple locations, with a level of sophistication that seemed impossible without protection. Financial ties to respected institutions and wealthy benefactors suggested influence far beyond a fringe religious sect. In his private journal, Blackwood wrote that he feared authorities had uncovered only the surface of something much larger, an enterprise that might survive, even if the brothers themselves were condemned. His greatest concern was not whether a verdict would be reached, but whether the full truth would ever be known. Those fears would soon feel eerily justified. The trial of Elder Ezra and Deacon Silas commenced on January 12, 1852, in Albany, New York, under extraordinary security. Crowds flooded the city daily, some traveling hundreds of miles to witness what newspapers had already labeled the trial of the unholy brothers. Inside the packed courtroom, the prosecution laid out its case with relentless precision over 6 grueling weeks. More than 100 witnesses testified. Former church members described how gentle spiritual guidance had gradually given way to manipulation. Fear and escalating rituals framed as acts of devotion. Medical experts presented findings from recovered remains, outlining patterns consistent with prolonged suffering and deliberate experimentation. Financial records demonstrated how the brothers had profited by supplying bodies and data to external institutions. The most devastating testimony came from families of the missing. Parents and spouses recounted watching loved ones change under the church's influence before vanishing without explanation. One mother described receiving letters from her teenage daughter that grew increasingly detached and unnatural, ending with a message announcing her selection for a sacred elevation. When she traveled to Ravenwood seeking answers, she was told her child had transcended and could not be seen. No body was ever returned. Throughout the proceedings, the brothers' demeanors sharply contrasted. Deacon Silas appeared hollowed and withdrawn, avoiding eye contact and speaking only in hushed tones to his attorneys. Elder Ezra, by contrast, remained unnervingly composed. He smiled during testimony describing suffering and nodded thoughtfully, as if listening to confirmation rather than accusation. When the defense finally rose, their strategy was clear. They did not deny that deaths had occurred. Instead, they argued that the practices of the Church of the Pure Spirit constituted protected religious expression, undertaken voluntarily by consenting participants. This argument collapsed under cross-examination. Former members testified to deception, coercion, and the use of substances later identified as narcotics designed to impair judgment. The final blow came with the introduction of records from the garden, proving that many victims had been forcibly taken rather than recruited. On March 2, 1852, with conviction all but certain, Elder Ezra requested to testify in his own defense. Against his lawyer's advice, the court allowed it. What followed stunned the nation. For nearly 4 hours, Elder Ezra spoke without notes, delivering a chilling monologue that resembled a sermon more than testimony. He expressed no remorse and denied nothing. Instead, he articulated a worldview that fused spiritual mysticism with cold rationalism. Death, he claimed, was inevitable. He had merely given it meaning. Those who suffered, he argued, contributed to knowledge that would one day elevate humanity itself. When questioned about the children discovered at the garden, his response drew audible gasps. He spoke calmly about purity, about unclouded observation, about suffering as illumination. A man in the gallery, later identified as the father of a missing boy, rushed the stand before being restrained. Elder Ezra did not move. When order was restored, he remarked that truth always provoked violence from minds unable to accept it. Deacon Silas refused to testify. His attorney offered a brief plea for mercy, citing manipulation and psychological domination by his brother. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. Both men were found guilty on all counts. On March 10, 1852, Judge William Blackwood sentenced the Ravencroft brothers to death by hanging, declaring their actions an offense against humanity itself. The execution was scheduled for April 15th, but the story was far from over. Days later, Prophet Caleb died in an asylum, under circumstances officially attributed to exhaustion, though rumors suggested otherwise. Then, on April 7th, a fire tore through the Albany jail. When the smoke cleared, multiple inmates and guards were dead. One body, identified by personal effects, was declared to be Deacon Silas. Elder Ezra was nowhere to be found. The ensuing manhunt became the largest in state history. Sightings were reported across the continent, none confirmed. As doubts grew, Blackwood questioned whether either brother had truly died. Financial records revealed a massive withdrawal from church accounts days before the fire, linked to a devoted follower who had vanished. The worst fears materialized in June 1852, when a physician connected to the case was found murdered, his body arranged in ritual fashion with a chilling message left behind. 2 similar killings followed. The implication was unmistakable. The work had not ended. By the mid-1850s, official efforts waned. Elder Ezra was presumed gone, possibly overseas. Yet scattered groups bearing eerie similarities continued to surface and vanish. Blackwood, though reassigned, pursued the case privately until retirement, convinced the enterprise had merely retreated into darkness. Decades later, evidence continued to emerge: abandoned sanctuaries, recovered journals, anonymous donations of disturbing manuscripts. One such collection, verified by handwriting experts, suggested Elder Ezra had survived into old age, convinced his work would shape the future. Whether authentic or not, the influence was undeniable. Elements of the brothers' ideology appeared in later movements, their shadow lingering in religious studies, criminal psychology, and medical ethics. Regulations governing research and anatomical study were born directly from the horror they revealed. Ravenwood itself never recovered. The land was cleared and fenced, left vacant. Even generations later, residents spoke of unnatural silence lingering over the site. More than a century and a half later, the Ravencroft legacy endures not just as a tale of evil men, but as a warning. A reminder of how easily faith, authority, and ambition can merge into something monstrous. And perhaps the most unsettling truth of all is this: the darkness they embodied was not unique to them. It was human. What do you think? Was everything truly uncovered, or does part of this story still remain hidden? If this story unsettled you, share it. Subscribe for more dark histories. And as always, the shadows remember.